Co-founder of the NAACP, editor of The Crisis, father of the Pan-African movement, and an outstanding scholar. W.E.B. Du Bois returned from a period of European study in 1894 with a dream to be a leader of his people. The brilliant young writer was blessed with a razor-sharp mind, but he soon discovered that strong words alone do not make a leader. Du Bois learned that hard lesson one afternoon in 1903. At that time in Atlanta, even a rumor that a black man had harmed a white woman could get him lynched. So when he heard that a man named Sam Hose had been accused of killing his white landlord and raping his wife, Du Bois decided to intercede in an effort to ensure a fair trial. He wrote a letter to the Atlanta paper, confident that the pen was mightier than the sword. But on his way to deliver it, he learned that Hose had already been lynched. He was saddened, stunned. Though Du Bois would use the pen again and again and again to further the cause of justice, he knew at that moment that action, not merely words, were desperately needed.
William Edward Burckhardt Du Bois was born on February 23, 1868, in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Shortly after William was born, his father, Alfred, left for Connecticut to establish a home for his wife and only son. William and his mother never saw or heard from him again. William, the only black in most of his classes, did well in school. In high school, he gave the commencement address. Rejected by Harvard, he attended Fisk University in Tennessee at the age of 17. At Fisk, Du Bois gained a deeper understanding of the systematic, legalized oppression that African Americans endured, especially in the South. In 1883, the Supreme Court overturned the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which had outlawed discrimination in public facilities. The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups used violence and intimidation to deny blacks any opportunity to protest. To learn more about conditions for Southern blacks, Du Bois spent his summers teaching in the area. The schoolhouse where he worked was a windowless log hut. Planks served as benches. There were no desks and few books. Du Bois reapplied and was accepted to Harvard in 1898, where he went on to earn a Master of Arts degree in political science. Among Harvard's faculty, philosophy professor William James recognized Du Bois as a brilliant scholar. A close relationship developed between the two. For the most part, though, Du Bois declined friendship with his white peers. He wanted to be completely encased in a black world. He was one of 6 graduates chosen by Harvard to deliver a commencement address. W.E.B. Du Bois then embarked upon a series of teaching positions and research projects. At Wilberforce University in Ohio, he taught Latin and Greek, but his profound interest in real people and their problems attracted him to the newly emerging field of sociology.
He was an individual committed to the liberation and uplifting of his people. He initiated and worked very hard for not only Africans in America, but Pan-Africanism for people of color throughout the world. He was dedicated to scholarship, to correcting the myths and the stereotypes. He tried to change the world by giving them the truth.
After returning to Harvard for his Ph.D., Du Bois took a teaching position at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. He interviewed 5,000 African Americans for the landmark sociological study, The Philadelphia Negro.
Du Bois came in conducted various types of interviews and collected data on the black community, and came to the conclusion that many of the depressed and oppressive conditions under which African Americans lived in South Philadelphia was the result of the discriminatory attitudes and practices of the larger society.
Dr. DuBois concluded that blacks would emerge from oppression only when strong leadership provided role models and political influence. In late 1897, Du Bois settled in the South for the second time with his wife Nina and their newborn son, Burkhart Gomer. Later that same year, the president of Atlanta University, Horace Bumstead, hired Du Bois to teach at the school. The field of black sociology was established under his stewardship there. In May 1898, at the age of 30, he launched a series of annual conferences on the problems plaguing black Americans. As Du Bois watched racism and political oppression increase in the United States, he, like other blacks, felt torn between two positions: absolute separation from the white race or full and equal integration into American society. Du Bois chose a balanced view on race relations that took into account his being both black and American.
That is, he referred to this as a kind of double consciousness. He said that African peoples in the United States look to Africa and their African background for their sense of identity, for their sense of peoplehood, for a sense of who they are. But at the same time, they are Americans and they lived in the United States and they are really removed from Africa.
A year later, Du Bois traveled to London, England, to help establish the Pan-African Association, a group that worked to advance the civil rights of Africans and their descendants around the globe.
Pan-Africanism is the concept that that what unites people of African descent who are scattered around the world is more important and more powerful, finally, than what separates them. That the difference between, say, an African American and an Afro-Caribbean is really minimal when one thinks of their common link to Africa.
And the Pan-African movement was to argue that African people, wherever they were, and the descendants of African people were one people, that they were united through history and through culture, but also through common destiny. They had a unity in their struggle against racism, oppression, and colonialism. So the Pan-African movement was to be the international aspect of black people's struggle for freedom.
As an expression of his commitment to black solidarity, Du Bois published his views on Pan-Africanism in a collection of essays titled The Souls of Black Folk. It became his first literary success.
What Du Bois says in The Souls of Black Folk is the essence of being Black American. That is, that one has two souls, one that's African, one that's American, and that these two souls really are at war with one another, and that war can result in the destruction of the African American mind and spirit unless the two sides are held doggedly together, as he himself says.
In these efforts to further the cause of racial equality, Du Bois met with opposition from an unlikely source. Booker T. Washington, founder of the Tuskegee Institute, was an eminent African American leader who believed that blacks should improve their industrial skills before demanding a higher place in American society. Du Bois disagreed, saying that black and white society had become interdependent and that both must change in order for progress to be made. He said that the educated black elite, the small percentage of black intellectuals whom he referred to as the talented tenth, should provide the strong leadership that the nation's blacks so desperately needed.
Dr. Du Bois felt that black people should be trained in all of the professions and the high arts, medicine, law, philosophy, history, and that these people who had the benefit of education had a particular responsibility to come back and educate and provide for the development of the whole community. So he talked about this talented tenth that had this special responsibility to the rest of black people.
Even though Washington and Du Bois both were working for the advancement of African Americans, their debates raged as one of the great intellectual battles of the dawning 20th century. In 1905, Du Bois secretly organized some of these talented tenth to meet in Buffalo, New York, to discuss the current state of black affairs. When they were refused service in a hotel dining room, they moved across the Niagara River to Canada.
They were in fact ejected, thrown out of a restaurant. So they went to Niagara, which was on the border of Canada, where they had more freedom to meet as an interracial group. And so the first beginnings of the NAACP was called the Niagara Movement, after the meeting which took place at Niagara Falls.
The Niagara Movement that was born established as its central objectives freedom of speech and criticism, the abolition of all caste distinctions based simply on race or color, and the recognition of the principle of human brotherhood. As the movement grew, it stated, "We claim for ourselves every single right that belongs to a freeborn American, political, civil, and social." The Niagara Movement focused the need for a strong biracial organization to lobby for and protect black rights. This prompted Mary Ovington, a white social reformer, to establish the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. Du Bois took the position of Director of Publicity and Research. Ironically, he was the only black person offered a position in that new organization. He was 42 years old. Du Bois established a monthly journal called The Crisis, which publicized the NAACP's activities. Through his writings in The Crisis, Du Bois came to be regarded by many as the outstanding black leader in the United States.
W.E.B. Du Bois is one of the foremost intellectuals of the 20th century in America and in the world. Students should be aware of Du Bois's many contributions to world civilization. He was an historian, an intellectual, a writer. He was involved in many of the dynamic developments that occurred in the 20th century in America as they related to the African American community.
And through The Crisis, through his hard-hitting editorials, through his calls for cultural renaissance, through his ceaseless monitoring of racism in America, he was able to stir black American intellectuals in particular, but also a fair number among the masses of black Americans, to be aware of themselves as African Americans and to work ceaselessly for progress.
But as time went on, the white leaders of the NAACP sought to distance themselves from some of his opinions. Du Bois wrote, for instance, in The Crisis, that blacks should arm themselves during racist attacks. Also, he supported the emerging Socialist Party. Initially, Du Bois did not support African American involvement in World War I. He became convinced, however, after attending a meeting with American military leaders, that the government was sincerely trying to address the demands of blacks. Du Bois believed that if African Americans fought for democracy abroad, then white America would be pressured into recognizing their full rights and equality at home. World War I did improve the prospects for blacks somewhat. Recruitment for the war effort depleted the white labor force and opened up jobs for blacks in the industrial North. Moreover, the African American soldiers who fought in Europe became accustomed to cultures that did not practice segregation. In African American history, two long-standing conflicts tower over all others: the disagreements between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, and the battle between Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. Intent on heightening black pride, Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA, introduced programs of educational and economic development similar to Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute. Garvey captured the attention of the black masses in a way that Du Bois never did. Garvey began to promote himself as a black Moses, striving to lead his people back to their African homeland.
He didn't necessarily feel that everyone should go there, but he felt that as many who wanted to go should have the right to return to the land of their ancestors and should use their skill and knowledge to build up a powerful government in Africa that could protect African people everywhere else in the world. So there was a very different view than Du Bois's view. Dr. Du Bois probably should be seen as the forerunner of the integrationist idea in the 20th century. Marcus Garvey was the forerunner of self-determination and black power.
In a strange turn of events, Garvey even solicited money from the Ku Klux Klan, a notoriously violent white separatist organization. Du Bois considered some of Garvey's tactics preposterous, calling his association with the Klan an unholy alliance. Du Bois became more radical in his views over the next 2 decades and developed The Crisis into a hugely popular publication. He was careful that, unlike other mass media, black life was presented decently and proudly. In 1934, Du Bois resigned from his editorial post at The Crisis and returned to Atlanta University, where he became chairman of the Department of Sociology.
By 1934, in the depths of the Depression, Du Bois began to be interested in radical socialism, and he also began to put forward ideas of voluntary self-segregation for blacks, which sounded very much like the position taken by Booker T. Washington at the beginning of the century, which Du Bois had opposed then. The NAACP was unalterably opposed to this idea of self-segregation and was also anti-communist, anti-radical socialist. And so on those ideological grounds, Du Bois and the NAACP parted company.
2 years later, Du Bois traveled around the world, observing the rapidly changing global political scene. He was particularly impressed with the Soviet Union, a country which had recently been revitalized by the Communist 5-year plan. In communism, he saw a possible alternative to the unequal sharing of resources, a problem he'd been writing about for over 50 years.
He felt that communism offered an opportunity for the equal distribution of wealth in the world. And as he saw it in the United States of America, African Americans seemed to always be on the short end. And the only way that he could see change coming would be through a revolution that would bring about an equal distribution of wealth.
In 1939, Du Bois published Black Folk Then and Now, an essay in the history and sociology of the Negro race. His views on the future of mankind and his personal creed were eloquently put forth the next year in an autobiographical work, Dusk of Dawn. He was 71. Once again, Du Bois's views caused him problems. Resisting his emphasis on black studies and wary of his political views, Atlanta University retired him from the faculty in 1943. At the age of 76, Du Bois, for the first time, found himself without employment. He returned to the NAACP, but made it clear he would not be censored or controlled. Du Bois joined Executive Secretary Walter White and educator Mary McLeod Bethune as consultants to the United States delegation at the founding of the United Nations in 1945. There he fought vigorously for the end of colonial rule in Africa and elsewhere. The elderly Du Bois became increasingly involved in NAACP activities, but the differences which had divided him and the board resurfaced, and the association dismissed Du Bois from his post. In 1950, Du Bois became chairman of the Peace Information Center, a group that the U.S. Department of Justice viewed as part of the Soviet Union's propaganda machine. That July, the FBI secretly began to collect evidence against Du Bois and the Peace Information Center. Du Bois's wife Nina died in Baltimore that year. Du Bois buried her in Great Barrington next to their son, Burkhart, bringing to a close a marriage that had lasted for more than half a century. During this time, the federal government had indicted the Peace Information Center for failing to register as an agent of the Soviet Union. One of those people singled out was W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois and his co-defendants were acquitted 8 days after the court proceedings began. Nevertheless, with the Cold War raging, the trial left him a marked man. Consequently, it was to Du Bois's great surprise and deep regret that he was forced to remain on the sidelines in the 1950s, when huge advances in the civil rights struggle came to pass.
He had taken on all of the challengers to the African American people, and he had answered all of them. He was a profound writer, a great debater, and so his position in the civil rights movement was that he had prepared the groundwork, the intellectual groundwork that made it possible for those who came after him to have arguments for the civil rights movement.
In 1958, Du Bois traveled to Prague, Czechoslovakia, to receive an honorary doctorate from the Charles University. Later that same year, he went to the Soviet Union to receive an honorary doctorate from Moscow University and the Lenin Peace Prize, one of the country's highest honors. He also held talks with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The highlight of his 10-week visit to the People's Republic of China was a meeting with party chairman Mao Zedong. In July of 1959, Kwame Nkrumah, president of Ghana, invited Du Bois to move to Accra to assemble the definitive Encyclopedia Africana. Before leaving the United States for good, Du Bois made one last political gesture. On October 1st, 1961, he joined the American Communist Party. When his passport expired and the American consulate in Ghana refused to renew it, Du Bois renounced his U.S. citizenship and became a Ghanaian citizen. Du Bois died on August 27, 1963. The United States of America was the only nation with a consulate in Ghana that did not send a representative to his funeral.
And at his death, Du Bois received a tremendous ovation when it was announced during the March on Washington in 1963, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave the I Have a Dream speech. I happened to be there, and I heard the announcement come over the loudspeaker that W.B. Du Bois had died in Ghana at the age of 93. And this, of course, there was a tremendous feeling of sadness and loss. But yet there was ovation for his life, because his life was singularly lived for the advancement of African people.
In fact, if young people were to travel to Ghana, West Africa today, they would see that there's an institution built in his honor. He was laid to rest there. And Africans in Ghana are attempting to build bridges with Africans throughout the world, particularly African Americans, based on the connection that Du Bois had with the country and with this country.
Du Bois was often characterized as a socialist and a communist by those who felt that many of his political views were anathema to those views of the American population. W.B. Du Bois is someone who should be well known to students because it was his opinion that the issue of color would be the ongoing problem of the 20th century.